We've mentioned earlier that private homes, harems, and certain places of worship were generally forbidden for the artists. This is certainly a contributing factor why so many Orientalist paintings are depictions of marketplaces and street life. There were occasional complications, even in busy street locations, as seen in this masterpiece by Gustav Bauernfeind, whose work we've looked at in detail in an earlier segment. It's entitled A Street Scene in Damascus, capital of Syria. The inspiration for this revealing work came from his second trip to the Orient in 1880 and 81, and prompted a letter from his sister living in Beirut at the time, and it stated, quote, "Damascus is, at all events, interesting, and from what I've heard, is a city whose Oriental character is still the least diluted by European civilization." I referred to the painting as revealing. A close look at the crowd reveals the artist, Bauernfeind, in the center, donning his pith helmet, brush in hand, trying to sketch. Initially amused by the overwhelming attention, it soon made painting on site often impossible, and necessary to find indoor quarters to rent with the ability to see and study the surroundings on the street. This was a problem for many of the painters trying to capture crowded, busy street scenes. The marketplace was often a richer source of paintable subjects. This major work by the Italian artist Herman David Solomon Corrodi pictures an open market scene, likely in Cairo, painted circa 1880. One can see a woman buying bread and tomatoes, men relaxing in a coffee shop, and merchants seated in front of their shops. This work, often considered the artist Karl Muller's masterpiece, illustrates the epic quality of his market scenes, is equaled by his ability as a portrait painter. Each face is an individual portrait captured in the bustling chaos of a Cairo street. The gathering of figures singing, cooking, and smoking is arranged across the canvas with a mural-like grandness. This work shows the artist can, in fact, get close to his subjects. Not all market activities took place on the streets within the cities proper. This equally powerful piece by Muller is entitled The Camel Market, Cairo, 1889. Given the significant role the camel played in the lives of the Sahara people, these markets were places of intense bargaining. The famous Camel Market of Cairo exists to this day. Note the rarely depicted in a painting baby camel in the foreground. These marketplaces were referred to by various names, such as Khan, Souk, or Bazaar. When one of the commercial camel caravans on the much-traveled trade routes arrived in Cairo, Damascus, Istanbul, etc., there was an increased level of people, camels, drivers, and handlers. Here we see the American Frederick Arthur Bridgman's work entitled In the Courtyard, painted in 1875, depicting a heated bargaining discussion about the sale of camels. Less chaotic is this street scene in Istanbul, painted by the French artist Hippolyte Barthol. One can see a figure carrying cuts of meat, and an orange seller in the lower right has cut a section of an orange and is offering it to a small child who appears a little reluctant. Note the unique shoes on the woman in the foreground. A close-up of the beautifully intricate patterns on the background wall is stunning and truly illustrates the observation that Islamic art is based on design and pattern. The Scottish artist Arthur Melville is today considered a major innovator in the art world. Although influential with his fellow artists of his day, he lacked comparable commercial success. He studied in Paris in 1878 to 80, when he departed for Persia, Egypt, and Turkey. The two watercolors here were painted in 1882 and are fairly rare images of Baghdad market scenes. The mosque seen in the background of this piece, entitled Baghdad, is the one often seen throughout the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 and was the backdrop for the tearing down of Saddam Hussein's statue. A subject that fascinated the Orientalist artists was the skills and occupations found in the stalls and alleyways throughout the marketplaces. Figures are represented producing all sorts of goods and services. Seen here is an old gentleman, legs crossed, busily spinning cotton. Karl Muller's work continues to impress, with this seated figure spinning cotton, a desired skill in a land dressed mostly in spun cotton cloth. Surprisingly little is known about the life of Jean Descartes, despite the superb quality of his work and his devotion to Oriental subject matter. Stimulated by his fascination with the Orient, Jean Descartes favored Morocco and the Moroccan people as the principal protagonist for his compositions. Intense studies of their culture enabled him to truthfully portray the richness of their daily lives. This work, entitled The Knife Sharpener, portrays a figure pursuing a simple but honest trade with grace and dignity, reflecting the best in Orientalist art. In this superb piece by Jean Descartes, entitled The Cobbler, the artist represents another street occupation. In this case, he's presenting a very humble figure, hooded and covered with a plain cloth robe without any fancy adornment. The classic Orientalist artists desire to paint a myriad of articles and other details can be seen in the cobbler's tools and spread of shoes in the foreground. In this classic Orientalist composition, Descartes positions a single figure surrounded by both the tools of his trade, rags, paint, and brushes, and finished pieces soon to be offered for sale. This is a small masterpiece entitled The Pottery Workshop. Although the artist Rudolf Weiss' place of birth is uncertain, he is considered part of the Austrian school. Entitled The Metalworker, painted in 1889, it is a theme many of the artists of the period painted. Here, Weiss not only executes a superb image of the metalworker, small hammer in hand, but pays careful attention to the structure behind him and its Mamluk period style of alternating red and white masonry. He's even supplied the street number of the building atop the door frame, number 77. Rudolf Swoboda was another gifted Austrian Orientalist artist who studied with Karl Muller. Swoboda made his first trip in 1879 and between 1880 and 1891 traveled 6 times to Cairo. Here is his masterpiece, entitled Carpet Menders, executed in 1883. Among the artisans working in the markets, the most talented must have been those entrusted to repair the highly valued carpets. In addition to Swoboda's attachment to Egypt, he was asked by Queen Victoria, in preparation for the crown's Jubilee, to come to Windsor Castle and paint portraits of several visiting craftsmen from India. She was so pleased, she funded a trip to India with instructions for the artist to paint portraits of, quote, her subjects, End of quote. This is an example of the extensive number of images he returned with. To return for a moment to The Carpet Menders and emphasize it was his masterpiece, it sold in 2008 for $2.3 million. Of course, the selling of carpets was an immensely popular subject for the artists. The incomparable Jean-Léon Gérôme depicts a single figure offering carpets for sale in one of the marketplaces entitled The Rug Merchant of Cairo, circa 1870. Consistent with the marketplace activity, the figures to the right appear to be negotiating something. It's been said the Khan el-Khalil Bazaar in Cairo, quote, was inspiration enough to produce nearly a lifetime's worth of pictures. This massive painting by Gérôme, entitled The Carpet Merchant, circa 1887, is one of his masterpieces. The small cluster of men appear to be potential buyers of substantial means. Gérôme has presented a complex and disciplined design in the huge hanging carpet with a random array of colors and designs in the carpets scattered across the floor. It's hard to envision a greater challenge for an artist to paint. The Spanish artist José Villegas Cordero has presented an almost hallucinatory display of shoes and slippers that live up to the imagination of Westerners or tourists wandering through the streets and stalls of the marketplace. It is a mesmerizing barrage of colors and textures. The Spanish and Italian artists bring a delicate, almost brittle effect to their paintings, designed to encourage the viewer to spend more time studying and marveling at the slipper merchant. It's been said one can find almost anything they desire in the Khan el-Khalil or the Cairo marketplace. Even, quote, what does the future hold in store, end quote. Fortune-telling, or predicting the future, goes back for millennia. Many religions forbid it, including Islam, but it continues. Many techniques were employed. A list of some in the Middle East: tarot cards, reading coffee grounds or tea leaves, numerology, palm reading, even tossing chickpeas or fava beans on the ground and reading the pattern, and many more too complicated to describe. From this work by Ludwig Deutsch entitled The Fortune Teller, it's really not possible to identify exactly what the fortune teller is doing. However, the next work clears it up, but only to a degree. The documentation accompanying this work by the Austrian artist Rudolf Ernst, entitled The Egyptian Fortune Teller, reads, quote, the practitioners use cards, crystal balls, tea leaves, or the prints left by a foot or a hand on sand. Here, a sage has told a Cairene, or resident of Cairo, woman, to press her hand on a pile of sand. Exactly how it's interpreted after that, only the fortune teller knows. Ernst has included another subtle feature in his composition. Look above the large entrance into the mosque. There are 2 ostrich eggs suspended in nets. These eggs were highly valued, both as spiritual symbols and for their material value, as early as the pre-dynastic periods in Egypt and many other countries around the Mediterranean basin. In contemporary Egyptian times, these eggs are present in both mosques and Coptic Christian churches. Czech-born Raphael von Ambros studied at the prestigious Vienna Academy alongside a roster of Oriental giants, names you've heard: Ludwig Deutsch, Jean Descartes, Rudolf Ernst. His highly detailed, meticulously rendered works fit the practices of the genre. This work, entitled quote, The Cellar of Antiques, dated 1885, is beautifully detailed with a large variety of items at his feet and wonderful images behind him. He appears to be holding a figure of Imhotep, the lioness goddess, in his hand. With the profusion of highly skilled craftsmen, it rapidly became a very complex question if an item was an authentic antique or a recent knockoff. In this piece, Jean Descartes, whose work we've seen, is picturing an antique dealer seemingly more established and trustworthy than the prior picture. Additionally, in, quote, The Connoisseur, the artist is consciously communicating that the Islamic world possesses great love and admiration for craftsmanship and works of both beauty and worth. Although the artist was born in Italy and studied with Karl Müller, he apparently adopted France as his home, as many of the Orientalist artists did. Though there is apparently some confusion about the artist Rudolf Weiss's date of birth and even the spelling of his name. The confusion sometimes goes further. There is another Orientalist artist by the same name. The two works presented here are by the same artist, and they reflect a theme in which he excelled: the depiction of the serious collector of fine objects. The first work, entitled The Collector, exhibits the distinctive qualities that drew him praise and awards. The subject of an Arab man, wrapped in thought and surrounded by collectibles, is a theme that Weiss perfected. The second piece is entitled, quote, The New Acquisition, and again reflects the strong Austrian Orientalist tradition of elaborately attired figures within an interior setting, surrounded by many different objects, each warranting careful study. The figure appears to be carefully examined, a piece of Chinese import porcelain. The coffee shop was found in virtually every marketplace or bazaar throughout the Arab world. It was something of a ritual for visitors wandering about or doing business to visit the coffee shop at some point. For the artist, it was fairly certain they would find a wide assortment of characters, as well as colorful settings to capture on canvas. Entitled Café Bausarda, this typical scene was painted by the American Addison T. Millar. Millar studied with William Merritt Chase prior to his departure in 1894 for further studies in Paris. He was encouraged by his fellow artists to visit Algeria and Morocco, which he did around 1896 or 97. This Algerian piece is typical of his work, specializing in images of the small shops or stalls selling everything from pottery and brassware to carpets and weapons. Upon his return to the U.S., Millar was the second artist to settle into and help found the Silvermine Art Colony in Connecticut. Henri Félix Philippetto was sent by King Louis-Philippe of France to accompany the French army on a campaign in Algeria in 1840. France ruled a sizable portion of Algeria since 1830, and an uprising or revolution triggered this military response, and the well-respected military history painter was sent to record the activities of the French army. His assignment was to paint scenes for murals to be installed in Versailles. In this work, entitled The Coffee Shop in Algiers, Philippetto provides a glimpse of Algerian street life with numerous figures cast in partial shadow. The artist also conveys his own fascination with Algiers and creates an appealing scene to the Western eye. The long-term permanent residents of Cairo, Italian artist Nicola Forcella, earned the reputation of being one of the most prominent resident artists and teachers in Cairo. He was a fairly regular exhibitor in the Paris Salon exhibitions. In spite of his recognition, not much is known about Forcello's body of work, other than it was largely dedicated to traditional scenes of Cairo. This unique perspective pictures the interior of a coffee shop, where the coffee is being brewed and served to customers outside. The figure on the right is smoking a shisha or glass water pipe. Most coffee shops would offer a pipe to its customers, which is still practiced nowadays. These coffee shops were widespread and amongst the chief social gathering places of the day. The role that music played in the Middle Eastern life is rarely the centerpiece of an Orientalist artist's work. Musicians are present as an accompanying object, as in Gérôme's The Whirling Dervishes painting we saw in an earlier segment. But music's importance is seen here. Both Spanish and Italian Orientalists had a fondness for exceptional skill in watercolor. This masterpiece by the Italian artist Gustavo Simoni exemplifies the best of the watercolor medium. The subject of musicians was of great interest to him. The mannerisms and facial expressions are exquisite and somehow convey how music in all cultures is transformative. Simoni was in Tunisia and Algeria in 1877 and 78 and returned to Europe for a short period. He made several trips during the 80s, living in the town of Tlemcen, Algeria. Simoni witnessed this scene at a local town festival. The magnificent setting of the island of Philae is a backdrop that even Radio City Music Hall or the Metropolitan Opera could not match. Entitled Musicians at Philae, Karl Müller has brilliantly blended the architectural splendor of ancient Egypt with an animated group of local cairns, or residents of Cairo, listening to a gathering of musicians entertaining them. Executed in 1877, Müller has captured a moment that feels totally real and in no way staged for the artist's benefit. Ludwig Deutsch was the acknowledged master of the Guard paintings, which we've seen. However, he did many quiet interior scenes as well, usually portraying a skill being demonstrated or a sales transaction of some sort. The year 1904 signaled Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly and the passing of Jean-Léon Gérôme. Deutsch seems to unite these two disparate events with his combination of music and the meticulous academic style of Gérôme. The instrument being played is called an oud, which is a lute played with a plectrum. The title of this work is The Mandolin Player, 1904, the year of Gérôme's passing. Although Napoleon officially opened up Egypt in 1799, during the first half of the 19th century, the lack of infrastructure made casual travel just too difficult. The majority of civilian visitors were either true adventurers or vandals, robbers, and thieves. In fact, the earlier 1900s was often called the half-century of plunder. During this period, vast quantities of antiquities were stolen, but also the European appetite for these artifacts fostered a growing and thriving antiquities trade, especially in Cairo. However, often what was sold as antique was of dubious authenticity. By mid-century, the science of Egyptology was well established, and archaeology was a serious endeavor. The more adventurous and generally wealthy Europeans began taking the Grand Tour, which is the title of this work, by the American artist Franz Rohrbach. Born and educated in Germany, he emigrated to America in 1885 and settled in Milwaukee, where he was primarily a mural painter. This second piece, by Belgian artist Frans Vink, is entitled Lunch at the Foot of the Pyramids, Giza. It vividly portrays two European tourists surrounded by residents of Cairo, engaged in, well, preparing a meal, studying these strange visitors, or just being there. This expanded view shows the male figure handing a coin to the fellow in front of him. Vink was a history and Orientalist artist who led a peripatetic life and worked in many countries throughout Europe. In the late 1850s, he spent a year in Egypt and Palestine. Strangely, Frans Vink became an instructor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Antwerp, and a student with whom he did not get along with was Vincent van Gogh. The next group of works simply doesn't fit. For a variety of reasons, they seem to defy a definition or classification. In some fashion, they are unique and worth commenting upon. We'll start with a seminal work by Jean-Léon Gérôme. For a moment, I'll withhold the title. Extraordinary is a word applied to almost everything he painted, but this is extra extraordinary, hypnotic. The blue tile work behind the row of seated figures, all obviously looking at something. This painting has been a lightning rod of fierce criticism going back roughly 50 years of academic debate and preachings of self-appointed taste makers. Why? Well, the other half of the painting and its title, The Snake Charmer, painted in 1880. We've mentioned the academic Edward Said, who wrote a scathing book published in 1978 attacking all forms of Western interpretations of the Middle East. This painting was the cover of the book. Yet, he never once, in all of his writings, mentioned or referred to this painting. But it became instantly propelled into the spotlight with academic jargon, or shall we call it art speak, that required a dictionary to read and understand it. And in English as well. Lines were used like a sleazy imperialistic vision of the East, an obviously pernicious and exploitative Western fancy. Observation on Gérôme's painting devices, quote, too detailed, appropriated and degrading architecture, ambiguous characters, antiquated weapons, and phallic imagery. Well, snake charmers were not part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was practiced in Egypt up through the 19th century. Gérôme spent years traveling throughout the Mideast. Did he personally witness a similar event? Well, we don't know. But the highly regarded French writer and pioneer photographer Maxime Duchamp spent 1848 to 1851 in Egypt and wrote, quote, nudity is not an erotic display. It is to obviate charges of fraud in the performance. He describes seeing snake charmer performance in Cairo, and it was comparable to Gérôme's paintings, including the boy disrobing to avoid charges of fraud. So, who is right? Is there a right? Well, to me, It's just a great work of art. The young French artist Henri Regnault has placed this scene in the Alhambra in Granada, Spain. For centuries, the palace of the Moorish kings of Andalusia. This is the classic shock image of the entire genre. It has been argued that it is the epitome of barbaric representations of Islam and Muslims in Orientalist paintings. The title of the painting leaves little to the imagination. Quote, "Execution without trial under the Moorish kings of Granada." End quote. It should not be overlooked that in the ancient and medieval world, and even in some places today, heads roll for incompetence, military failure, disloyalty, or simply petty crimes. Scenes like this were not uncommon in the world of kings, caliphs, dictators, and tyrants, Muslim or Christian. The artist Henri Regnault painted this in 1870 at 27 years old. It was one of his last paintings. He died less than a year later as a soldier towards the end of the Franco-Prussian War. Henri Regnault is perhaps the most tragic loss in the world of Orientalism. He most certainly would have been one of its masters. This almost disturbing painting by Boston-born artist Charles Sprague Pierce, entitled Lamentations over the Death of the Firstborn Child, Egypt, was painted in 1877. Pierce was a blend of many things and movements of his day. Abandoned American post-Civil War, arrived in Paris in 1873, traveled the Nile with devoted Orientalist Frederick Arthur Bridgman, intrigued by Orientalism, yet also wished to be a history painter and interpret passages from the Bible, etc. This unique work is based upon a passage from the Old Testament, Book of Exodus, describing the 10th plague of Egypt, when God declared his intention to kill the firstborn Egyptian child unless the Pharaoh freed the Israelites. It is a fact that in the Victorian era, when this was painted, infant mortality was still prevalent, and this painting triggered grief among many parents who had lost a child. Times do change. While researching this work, I came across a website offering this exact image as an art print on t-shirts, towels, tote bags, coffee mugs, throw pillows, and truly inexplicable greeting cards. I suppose at some point an artist would try to capture an Orientalist image of someone, quote, on the high side, appropriately entitled The Effects of Hashish, painted in 1875 by a lesser-known Italian artist, Pasquale Leotta. This appears something like a role reversal of masculine and feminine. Rather than a heavily armed warrior smoking a fearsome water pipe, we see a slight, almost effeminate man lying passively on a red divan in a posture reminiscent of harem girl images. Even the manner he holds his hand to his ribs conveys a delicate feminine touch. The man is a sensualist who enjoys his hashish. Today, if he were given a form to fill out and identify his gender, he might find it challenging with 5 or 6 choices to make. Prior to stop-action cameras, a big challenge for artists was to convincingly capture a sense of violent movement or speed in a still image. Jean-Léon Gérôme has done just this in his work entitled The Pyrrhic Dance. This action-filled image is in a Cairo cafe. The two figures are quite heavily armed, especially for a dance. The fact is, it was a famous dance in ancient Greece, performed prior to the dancers entering battle. It is thought to have originated at the time of the Trojan Wars, and historically was adopted by Sparta as its national dance. How this ancient and often violent war dance found its way to Egypt, performed in a mock capacity for entertainment purposes, I don't really know. However, the figure in the white pleated skirt on the right is dressed like a Bashi Bazouk, who were mercenary forces fighting for the Turks. Perhaps the dance migrated to Egypt from them. Whatever the source, Jerome has brilliantly caught the figures, while the viewers can feel the trajectory and bounce of the dancers. When first seeing this massive painting, I assumed it was an all-out cavalry charge at an enemy. A closer look revealed soldiers on horses and on foot, along with those mounted on camels, and it seemed frenzied, with no discipline. Its title, The Flight of the Khalifa, 1898, and a reference to the Battle of Omdurman, indicated it was a retreat, not an attack. The British artist R. Talbot Kelly was a long-term resident of Cairo from 1883 to 1915, fluent in Arabic, with a studio in the city, who traveled extensively throughout Egypt and was a respected fine artist and illustrator. First, what does Khalifa mean? It's a term meaning ruler or leader. Next, what was the Battle of Omdurman? Now comes the complex history of colonialism and wars of conquest, fought all along the path of the Nile. To simplify, Sudan, south of Egypt, had been ruled by an Islamic sect called the Mahdist since roughly 1881, and was perceived by the British rule in Egypt as a threat. The Mahdist forces had earlier killed the beloved British General Gordon in an engagement in Khartoum, which was in fact portrayed in the 1966 film Khartoum with Charlton Heston. Numerous lesser skirmishes occurred over the ensuing years until Lord Kitchener was tasked with fully defeating the Mahdist forces, inflicting retribution for Gordon's death and returning the Sudan to British control. He trained his massive Anglo-Egyptian forces for close to 2 years before attacking the Khalifa, or ruler, in 1898, which culminated in the Battle of Omdurman. Later, the event was described as not a battle, but a massacre. Kitchener had modern rifles, machine guns, cannons, and a flotilla of 10 gunboats on the Nile. The ill-equipped Mahdi forces suffered 10,000 killed, 10,000 wounded, and 5,000 captured, with Kitchener's army suffering less than 50 killed. The painting depicts the remnants of the Khalifa forces fleeing from the site of the massacre. It's reported that Kitchener had a large numbers of the wounded killed. Interestingly, a young lieutenant in the British 21st Lancers participating in the battle later was extremely critical of Kitchener's killing of the wounded. His name was Winston Churchill. It is hard to accept that just maybe there are a few paintings that are better described as whereabouts unknown. This would be one of them. It is entitled English Suppression of an Indian rebellion, painted in 1884. This photographic image of the painting is the only visual record of it. The Russian artist who painted it is Vasily Vereshchagin, who can be described simply as remarkable, and he will be examined in depth in our next episode. According to a biography written on the artist, this gruesome image was based upon an 1857 mutiny of the sepoys, who were native Indian soldiers in the British Army. They believed that the military's westernizing policies were threatening Indian culture. The mutiny was also a function of racial and religious antagonisms. The act of, quote, blowing from guns, end of quote, is depicted here with a group of Sikh peasants who themselves had been waging a long and bitter struggle against the British. They are seen with their backs tightly strapped to a British cannon. Hindus believed that death by bullet or hanging would be viewed in the other world as an expression of martyrdom. Death by cannon, however, instilled positive terror, since it blows the body into several pieces, unable to enter heaven in a decent form. It's been reported that many witnesses of this brutal form of execution were astounded at the bravery and resignation of the Indians. The British military repeatedly downplayed this practice, stating it had been used, quote, only on a few occasions. Paintings of this unflinching, uncompromising truth could have the capacity to initiate war. Perhaps it is best they are lost. Our sixth and final episode reaches opposite ends of the emotional spectrum, from grim to hilarious. For grim, one can usually count on a Russian artist. In this case, the acknowledged master of painting the grim truth of barbarism and war, not its glorified version of heroics on the battlefield, but the brutal aftermath. For hilarious is a look at the impact of various events in the Orient, especially the discovery of Tutankhamun and Tut mania has had on the West. A minor and forgotten ruler in his lifetime, a few thousand years later, Tut is the most recognized symbol of the ancient Mideast. You'll enjoy this one.